The
Em
rain
yêu anh
drummed
nhiều
against the
lắm.
floor-to-ceiling windows of the
Anh cũng
42nd
yêu
floor
em.
as
Đừng
Avery
lo gì cả.
Sinclair pushed back from her mahogany desk and rubbed her tired eyes. The law offices of Harlan and Associates stretched out before her in the dim evening light, empty except for the soft hum of sleeping computers and the distant sigh of elevator doors opening somewhere down the hall. She glanced at her Rolex. 9:15 p.m., another 16-hour day defending corporate clients who paid her firm's astronomical fees without blinking. The elevator chimed, and she heard the familiar squeak of wheels crossing polished marble. Every night, same time, same sound. The cleaning crew had arrived. Avery had been keeping these hours for 3 years, ever since making partner. But only recently had she started to notice the quiet efficiency of the man assigned to her wing. Tonight, as she gathered her files, she caught herself watching him through the glass walls of her office. He moved with purpose, never rushing, never wasting emotion. His uniform was always pressed, his manner professional even when he thought no one was looking. While other cleaners chatted or played music through earbuds, he worked in focused silence. "Evening, ma'am," he said at her doorway, hands steady on the cart's handle. His voice was warm, respectful, but not subservient. It was the same greeting he'd given her for months. But tonight, something made her really look at him. "Good evening," she replied, setting down her briefcase. "I don't think we've properly introduced ourselves. I'm Avery Sinclair." He paused as if surprised by the invitation to speak. "Malik Carter. I clean this floor every night." "I've seen you here for months," she said, gesturing to her desk, already neater for his presence. "You're very thorough. I appreciate that." Malik nodded, dark eyes meeting hers briefly before he returned to arranging his supplies. There was intelligence in that glance, an alertness that didn't match the invisibility people projected onto uniforms in buildings like this. In Avery's world of expensive suits and power lunches, she'd learned to read people quickly. Malik Carter was not what he appeared to be. "You work late every night," he observed, lifting her wastebasket with practiced ease. "The law doesn't sleep," she said with a tired smile. "What about you? Is this your only job, or do you have other work?" "This pays the bills," he said simply. But the tone wasn't apologetic. It carried a quiet dignity that hinted at a second life beyond night shifts and rolling carts. As he worked around her desk, she noticed he'd straightened the stack of business journals she'd abandoned at odd angles. Not just straightened, but organized them by issue date, spines aligned, tabs flush. A small thing, but the kind of detail that went beyond basic custodial work. When he finished and angled the cart toward the door, she found herself hoping he would turn back. "Malik," she said softly. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Have a good night." "You too, Miss Sinclair. Try not to let this place keep you forever." After he left, Avery sank into the leather chair and stared at the precisely stacked journals. For the first time in months, she was curious about someone who wasn't a client, a partner, or a judge. There had been something in Malik Carter's eyes, depth where she didn't expect it on a rain-polished 42nd floor after hours. She packed her briefcase more carefully than usual, wondering what tomorrow night might bring. The next evening, she found herself glancing at the clock more often than was reasonable. At 9:10 p.m., the elevator doors slid open, and that same quiet squeak crossed the marble. When Malik appeared, she was ready. "Working late again," he said. That same warmth threaded through his voice. "Seems to be my specialty." She closed her laptop. "What about you? Do you work anything else during the day?" He began his routine, but he moved a little slower near her conference table, as if he too was extending the moment. "I do some consulting." Her brows lifted. "What kind of consulting?" "Small business development, Central and South End, CD, Rainier Valley, Beacon Hill. Folks trying to turn side hustles into something stable." "What does that mean in practice?" "Financial plans, market research, vendor relationships, helping people get bank meetings that don't mysteriously vanish." He wiped the table in smooth lines. "Nothing as high stakes as what you all do up here." She heard no bitterness, only a clear reading of two very different ecosystems. "Business development is crucial," she said. "Probably more important than most of what happens in these offices." He looked over, surprised but not skeptical. "You think so?" "I know so. I grew up in Windermere," she admitted. "But I've seen what happens when neighborhoods lose local businesses. Communities fray. What got you into law? He asked. She blinked, unprepared for a question about motivations rather than outcomes. I thought I wanted to help people, she said slowly. Turns out corporate law often protects money more than people. You're good at it, he said, nodding toward her framed clippings in the neat row of plaques. Success isn't always the same as satisfaction. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it felt honest in a way she hadn't managed in a long time. He studied her, not the suit, not the office, but her face, as if testing whether the room could hold that honesty. Sounds like you know about systems that don't work for everyone, he said gently. Maybe I do, she answered. He finished the desk and started toward the door. Malik, she said, impulse racing past caution. If I brought a few small business files down from our pro bono queue, would you look at them with me? Tell me what I'm not seeing? He considered her as if weighing whether the offer was extraction or partnership. You mean during the day? In daylight, she said. Coffee. We look together. I can buy you a latte that doesn't require a mortgage. That coaxed the first full smile she'd seen. It transformed him, made the room feel less like a vault and more like a place where plans could be sketched in pencil. I'd like that, he said. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. The coffee shop she chose the next day was neutral ground, neither marble and brass nor hole in the wall trying to prove something. She arrived early and to her surprise felt nervous. This wasn't two people orbiting each other after hours anymore. This was intentional. Daylight. When he walked in without the uniform, she almost didn't recognize him. Gray sweater, dark jeans, that measured way of scanning a room that said he'd always paid attention because attention was free when nothing else was. His smile found her across the space. This is nice, he said, settling in. A place that sells coffee without pitching a lifestyle. They ordered. She slid a folder across. This restaurant owner keeps getting hit with licensing violations. He skimmed a page and tapped a paragraph. She's not cutting corners on licenses. She's cutting corners on cash flow. Compliance is a symptom. We fix the model. The paper stops bleeding. How would you do it? Revenue mix, cost discipline, a week-by-week cash map, vendor terms renegotiated with someone vouching for her. Then, legal cleanup with a calendar that alerts before the city does. She found herself writing down his words, practical, unsentimental, rooted in the realities of rent and payroll, and the fragile courage it took to risk any of it. The next file, the next. Each time, he saw the human system beneath the legal problem. Each time, she realized where the law ended and community began. You know what strikes me, she said finally. You understand these businesses better than most of my partners understand their clients. I understand them because I live near them, he said, not bragging. Because I've stood in line when the EBT hits on the 1st and the 15th. Because I know what a broken fridge does to a week's margins. They talk beyond files, about the city's changing spine, about what opportunity looks like when it avoids your block, about the difference between being welcomed into rooms and tolerated in them. When they stepped back onto the wet sidewalk, Avery felt like a hinge inside her had just found the right door. Thank you, he said, pausing beside her car, for treating my opinion like it matters. It does, she said, more than you know. They didn't touch. They didn't rush. They let the reins say the thing both of them were still careful about putting into the air. By Saturday, neither of them pretended it was only about files. Dinner at a Capitol Hill spot where their pairing wouldn't be the main course. He wore a navy blazer and walked like someone who didn't need a room's permission to belong in it. She wore a black dress and a steadiness she hoped would survive Monday. Tell me something true no one expects of you, he said over salmon in a shared grin. I wanted to teach second graders, she answered. I like watching the moment a kid's face changes because the world just got bigger. It's not too late, he said, as if the word late had never met a person who worked nights to keep his mother's lights on. They didn't pretend not to see race. They didn't pretend the firm's gala wouldn't test them. They didn't pretend her mother would applaud. They didn't pretend it would be easy. They chose quietly and then again out loud. On Monday, the world reacted exactly the way Malik predicted. Polite faces, sharp edges, appropriate, whispered like a dress code. A senior partner suggested she consider the firm's image when selecting a date for the charity gala. Her mother called to make sure she was being thoughtful about appearances. That night, when Malik appeared in her doorway, she told him everything. "So it begins," he said. "What do? We decide if we're going to be half brave or whole brave." She looked at the rain welding the city to the glass. "Whole brave." "Then invite me to the gala," he said, "not as a dare, but as a plan. You'll hate it. I'll stand next to you." "Then yes," she said, "come with me." The ballroom would test them. The Whisper Network would hum. Her mentor would smile a warning. Her mother would arrive in diamonds. And Avery, who had learned how to win rooms like this, would discover whether she could stand in one without losing herself. The Four Seasons ballroom glowed with chandeliers and curated generosity. Waiters moved like choreography in black and white. Avery's navy dress felt exactly right until the elevator opened, and the room turned into a mirror maze of glances. Malik's hand at the small of her back steadied her as they stepped through murmurs that pretended not to exist. He was unhurried at the bar, asked for sparkling water, lifted it in a quiet toast that made the bartender smile. Elena from Avery's team appeared with relief written all over her. She complimented Avery, welcomed Malik, said she'd been telling Avery for months that the pro bono pipeline needed business consulting, not just legal triage. Malik said smart woman. Elena laughed, squeezed Avery's arm, and vanished into a swirl of judges and donors. Senior partner Bradley arrived next, a cluster of rain-slick men in his wake. He shook Malik's hand and asked what he did, held the word community a heartbeat longer than necessary. Malik answered with specifics about vendor terms and bank meetings and cash maps. Richard Hayes, kinder eyes, said those neighborhoods faced real barriers. Malik agreed and added that they also generated solutions faster than any think tank when actually resourced. Bradley's smile stayed like a stamp that won't come off your hand after a concert you didn't want to attend. Avery felt herself split. One part stayed at Malik's shoulder, reading faces, translating micro-gestures into appraisal or curiosity or quiet disapproval. The other part rose to a balcony somewhere near the ceiling and looked down at the choreography she had learned to master. The balcony view made it all look smaller than it used to. The people, the rules, the approval that had once been oxygen. Her mother arrived with a cool perfume of winter roses and a precision that made rooms adjust. Catherine Sinclair assessed Malik without blinking and asked polite questions with carefully placed commas. When Malik stepped to the bar, Catherine leaned in close. "Compatibility matters, darling. Shared backgrounds, values, circles. She called it common sense." Avery heard it as a cage. Malik returned and read the weather in Avery's eyes faster than any meteorologist. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and the relief was a tide going out so quickly she almost stumbled. They drove in a quiet that didn't feel like retreat. At a red light, Malik took her hand and said, "If we do this, we don't apologize to rooms that want us smaller. We choose each other in the places that make choosing complicated." "Whole brave," she said. "Whole brave," he echoed. Monday delivered the invoice. James Mackenzie's office smelled like leather and winning photographs. He talked about perception and image and the firm's long record of inclusion in the same breath he used to question Avery's judgment. He said clients had concerns. He said her choices might suggest divided loyalties. He used the word excellence as if it were a club membership. Avery kept her spine straight and her voice level. "Damon Jefferson has an MBA," she almost said, then remembered she was mixing names from the news articles she'd read about a different firm and caught herself before revealing how frayed her edges were. She corrected, said Malik Carter runs a consulting practice and conducted himself with more professionalism at the gala than anyone who quizzed him like a novelty. "Be that as it may," Mackenzie said, and the phrase carried all the weight of a door closing politely. She made it back to her office and stared at the view until the buildings blurred. When Malik arrived that evening, she told him every syllable. "So now it isn't just whispers," he said. "It's policy disguised as advice." She wanted to be brave and practical at the same time. She wanted to light a match and also not burn down her life. "What do we do?" she asked. "We tell the truth louder than their euphemisms," he said, "and then we decide what we can afford to lose." He sat in her visitor's chair and watched the rain scribble silver lines down the glass. "You've built a perfect ladder," he said softly. I won't ask you to jump if you're not ready to land where my people are already standing. She breathed once, deep enough to reach some private vault. I am ready to learn to stand there. They met for coffee in the Central District the next afternoon. Not neutral this time. It mattered to her to be where his world felt like home, where she was the one learning the names behind the counters. People greeted him by name. He introduced her without fanfare. No one stared. No one used the word appropriate like a velvet rope. They dug into numbers for the catering couple they'd been advising and sketched a debt restructure for the restaurant owner. Built a calendar that would ping with deadlines before the city did. He drew boxes and arrows. She wrote clauses and safeguards. They were better together than they were apart, and both of them knew it. The day after that, her assistant delivered a neat stack of pink slips made of email. Clients requesting other counsel, a board lunch she wasn't invited to anymore, a meeting rescheduled while she was at her desk. Each subtraction was small enough to be deniable, all of them together a geometry that made a message. She stayed late because staying late felt like agency when everything else was narrowing. At 9:06 p.m., a text buzzed from Malik. Family emergency. Can't come in. I'll call tomorrow. It was uncharacteristically brief. She tried to call. Straight to voicemail. Anxiety opened like a trapdoor. 10:30 found her on his block. She knocked and tried not to feel like she was crossing a line he hadn't drawn for her yet. The door opened on a face that had not slept, and a room that was tidy because tidy was how you stayed strong. My mom, he said, diabetic coma. Harborview. They don't know. Let me drive. He started to argue. She held his gaze. Let me drive. At Harborview's ICU, the hum of machines made a choir no one wanted to join. His sister Jasmine was there in scrubs, eyes sharp, spine wired with caffeine and grief. She was skeptical at first, the way anyone would be when the world was collapsing, and a polished woman from Windermere walked in, holding her brother's hand. Then Avery said the sentence that felt like stepping out of a plane before you tested the parachute. I love your brother. It changed the room's air pressure. It gave Jasmine a target to test. Are you prepared to love the bills, the nights, the community that will not applaud you? She asked without blinking. Yes, Avery said, especially those. Dorothy Washington woke like someone surfacing from a long, dark pool and found her children and a stranger with soft hands and eyes that didn't flinch. She asked questions that mattered more than small talk. Why him? Why now? Do you understand that loving my son means loving where he stands? Avery answered without performative humility. Malik makes me better and braver. He's teaching me to see what my degree ignored. I want to build things that actually carry weight. Dorothy studied her face and found no easy outs there. She smiled, small and satisfied, then asked for real water instead of the sip cup. Strength looks like that in every language. In the waiting room after the doctors used a voice that finally sounded less like a cliff, Avery and Malik sat with paper cups in a vending machine's version of dinner. He told her about the spreadsheet no one ever sees where you decide whether the electric bill or the insulin refill gets paid if the car stutters that month. She told him about trust funds and how shame had replaced gratitude once she realized what doors that money had opened without her even noticing the handle. He apologized for keeping parts of his life behind glass. She apologized for assuming glass was the only way to see clearly. They laughed, a soft sound in a hard place, and the nurse at the desk looked up and smiled because sometimes two people in an ICU laughing quietly means the universe is not entirely unkind. Dorothy stabilized. Jasmine went home to shower and sleep. They drove in the blue hour, the city a map of small lights. Malik asked if Avery was still sure. She said she was more sure now than when she was wearing a navy dress and a practiced smile. Back at the firm, the water narrowed to a stream. A high-profile case slid to another partner. Her pro bono hours were questioned for the first time in her career. Mackenzie called her in and said the firm valued her contributions and wanted to make sure her focus remained aligned with client priorities. She understood the language. She had written this kind of email herself. She worked anyway. She met Malik's clients at the community center on Saturday mornings and taught incorporation to a room full of people who brought kids and notebooks and the kind of attention that makes a teacher feel like a person. She saw how the law could be a bridge instead of a border and for the first time in years, the word career felt too small. On a Tuesday that felt like a hinge, she printed her resignation letter and sat with it in her lap while rain threaded the window. She had built a ladder one rung at a time. She could keep climbing and watch her lungs give out, or she could step into a room with fewer chandeliers and more light. She signed. She walked to Mackenzie's office with the calm of a person who already knows what the conversation will cost and what it will buy. He warned her about reputational impact and the difficulty of rebuilding a book outside an established platform. She thanked him for everything he had taught her. He looked genuinely startled when she said she was grateful. She was. The ladder had gotten her to the height from which she could finally see the bridge. When she stepped out of the elevator with the banker's box everyone jokes about and no one wants to carry, Malik was waiting on the sidewalk in a gray coat and rain that looked like confetti. He took the box and balanced it on one hip. He did not say, "Are you sure?" He did not say, "Congratulations." He said, "There's a storefront on Rainier that's been empty for 6 months." She laughed once, on an exhale that shook. "Show me." They drove. The space had old hardwood and a back room that could hide a copier and 2 desks that would have to be bought secondhand. A window looked out over a bus stop where 3 teenagers were making each other wheeze with laughter. Avery stood in the middle of the empty floor and felt the dangerous, liberating certainty of starting with less. Jefferson and Sinclair Community Legal and Strategy would fit above the door. Elena texted 2 words that made Avery cry in the car. "I'm coming." They made a list on the white wall in pencil. Lease, insurance, sliding scale model, workshops, intake forms that didn't shame people, coffee that didn't taste like a punishment, a shelf of children's books because clients have kids, a bulletin board for jobs and childcare share, a calendar that would ping before the city did, a small sign that said, "You belong here." They wrote numbers next: startup costs, rent, a budget that left space for hardship and a little stubborn joy. Avery ran the legal math while Malik ran the operations model, and the numbers met in the middle like 2 hands that knew where the other was reaching. They painted on a Sunday and fought about the playlist and ended up singing quietly to a song both of them pretended was not perfect. Dorothy brought sandwiches. Jasmine brought a plant. Elena brought a laminator and an unstoppable grin. The first week, 3 people walked in by mistake and stayed because someone finally spoke regulation in plain English and wrote down the steps like a map you could actually follow. At night, when the last chair was pushed in and the sign turned to closed, they sat on the floor and let exhaustion take their backs to the wall. Avery would say, "I'm terrified and exhilarated." Malik would say, "That means we're not dead." She would laugh and the laughter would bounce off the fresh paint and come back sounding like a future. 6 weeks in, their Saturdays looked like community, folding tables lined with notebooks and toddlers drawing galaxies with crayons, small business owners asking questions that had never been welcomed in conference rooms with bottled water. Malik opened the workshop with a sentence that explained everything they were trying to be. The goal isn't just to grow revenue, it's to grow roots that can survive a hard winter. Avery taught legal structures like she was teaching kids how to cross a street. This is an LLC. It guards your house from your lease. This is a contract. It keeps promises from disappearing when someone forgets their good intentions. She saw faces change when paper stopped being hostile. She saw posture rise when a city form became manageable, because someone had broken it into steps and dates and a checklist that made sense. Elena ran intake with a way of speaking that made people feel smart for asking hard questions. She translated roar into documentation. She put candy at kid height and pens beside every form. She arranged chairs in a semicircle because circles make better conversations than lines. They lost some nights to panic when the bank account dipped below a threshold that had nothing to do with trust funds and everything to do with light bills. Avery texted an old client to ask for a donation and had to step into the supply closet to breathe when they said no with a flourish. Malik called 3 restaurateurs who owed him favors and got a sponsorship that paid the printer lease for 3 months. They learned that pride, like paint, had to dry longer than you expected, or it would smudge. One afternoon, a developer came in with shiny shoes and the kind of smile that means someone is about to confuse charity with control. He offered a grant with a brand placement the size of a billboard. Malik listened and said, "Your money's good, but not if it turns this into your photo op." The man suggested they were being ungrateful. Avery said gratitude is the wrong word for a contract that asks us to make our clients into your marketing. The man left with his smile intact and his eyes slightly narrower. They celebrated by buying cupcakes from the bakery 2 doors down and giving one to the kid who always looked in their window on his way home from school. The first big win hit on a Wednesday. The restaurant owner whose licensing had become a monthly ambush stood in their doorway. With tears she tried to hide. The plan had worked. Vendor terms shifted. The cash map held. Compliance arrived on time for the first time in 6 quarters. She brought foil pans of food and set them on their folding table and fed the entire room because celebration is a strategy. That night, after the last pan was scraped clean, Malik asked Avery if she was happy. Not content. Happy. She said she felt like she finally worked in sentences she could stand to read twice. He said good and then went quiet in the way a person does before they say something that will change everything again. I want to ask you something, he said, voice steady, eyes steady, the room steady enough to hold it. I want us to be official in every way. Marry me. He didn't kneel. He didn't stage it. He didn't turn it into a photo. He asked like a builder inviting a co-architect to sign a plan. Yes, she said, and the word fit in her mouth like it had been waiting there for years. They told Dorothy over empanadas at the small Mount Baker house that had become their family table. Dorothy blessed them in a voice that sounded like Sunday and 7 weekdays of work. Jasmine hugged Avery hard enough to make her ribs complain and then asked about a prenup because love makes you practical. Avery laughed and said absolutely and meant it. Love is not afraid of good paper. The backlash found them anyway. An op-ed written by a former client called Avery's Departure, a betrayal of excellence. A blogger lifted photos from the gala and embedded them in a narrative that pretended to be concerned for her future, while trafficking in the comments section's worst parts. Avery didn't read the comments. She read the names of the people who came through their door that week and decided attention is a currency she would spend differently now. One evening, her mother asked her to lunch at a place with white tablecloths and waiters who stood like punctuation. Catherine started with weather and charity boards and the opera's new director, then folded the conversation back to where she wanted it. You've made your point, she said. Come back before the damage calcifies. Avery stirred her tea and watched the lemon slice turn the water a pale, pretty color without changing its nature. I didn't leave to make a point, she said. I left to build a life I can recognize. Catherine tried the word phase and the phrase romantic illusions. Avery said contract clinic. Line by line, scheduled 3 months out. Catherine said embarrassment. Avery said impact. They spoke different languages with shared roots. They parted with politeness that hurt less than open warfare and more than honesty. At the practice, a new case arrived that tested everything. 3 family daycares on the same block were being squeezed by a landlord who wanted to triple rent because he had a letter of intent from a tavern chain. The daycares served 27 children. The families couldn't drive across town. The city's licensing rules were a labyrinth. Avery built a file like a fortress. Malik built a coalition like a choir. They learned the zoning code like a lullaby, paired it with letters from pediatricians and the school principal, found a council member who remembered who raised her while her mother worked a swing shift. They lost the first hearing. They won the second. They negotiated a rent increase that could be carried without breaking the backs that carried the children. Afterward, the daycares brought finger-painted thank you notes. Avery pinned them to the bulletin board with a reverence she had never felt for plaques. Malik's grandmother's recipe for peach cobbler appeared in a laminated card on their shelf. And somehow it felt like incorporation documents did on the day you finally get your state stamp. It meant belonging. Late one night, Avery unlocked the office to grab a file and found a folded note slipped under the door. It was from a man who had sat in the back row of their last workshop and said nothing. He wrote that he hadn't trusted lawyers since a bad eviction in 2012, but watching her translate the city's notice into a list he could carry home made him think the law was not just the thing that happened to you. He wrote thank you in a hand that tried to make the letters behave. She read it twice and then again, and then she cried in a quiet room because sometimes thank you is the entire reason. They were tired. They were joyful. They were fluent in forms and feelings. On the night before their small wedding, they dragged 2 chairs onto the sidewalk, ate takeout from paper boxes, and counted the kinds of wealth they hadn't been taught to count. Time, neighborhood, names learned, kids waving in the window, the exact stretch of daylight in winter. The first morning, a client walked in by herself instead of sending her cousin because the last client told her it was safe. Malik asked her again if she was happy. She said she was the kind of happy that doesn't perform for the camera. He said, "Good." She said, "Your turn." He said, "I am the kind of happy that makes you want to guard the gate and also leave it open, because what is the point if you build something and forget to make room for everyone it was built for?" They went home. They slept. They woke up to their wedding day in a city that had learned their names. They married in a community center gym that smelled faintly of floor varnish and possibility. Folding chairs dressed in white covers. A rented arch wrapped with eucalyptus. Dorothy in pale blue. Jasmine in a dress she bought on a resident's salary and made look like couture. Elena cried before the vows started and laughed at herself out loud. A pastor who had watched Malik grow up spoke a blessing that fit the room without shrinking God. Avery wore a simple dress that she would be able to sit in at a folding table later. Malik wore a suit that fit his shoulders like a plan he intended to keep. When they said "I do," there was a sound in the room like a collective exhale, the way people breathe when they watch a balance achieved that took so much work to hold. After cake that someone's aunt made and coffee that tasted like generosity, they danced to a song that belonged to both of them because it belonged to everyone there. Her mother stood at the back, hands clasped, a look on her face that shifted more times than Avery could count. After a long minute, Catherine approached, touched Avery's cheek, and said in a voice softer than it had been in months, "You look happy." "I am," Avery said, and left it there because some arguments need to rest. They went back to work on Monday with rings that clicked gently against pens. The bus stop teen waved every morning now. The daycares sent muffins with blueberries like small planets. The restaurant owners showed up with a problem they were glad to help solve because success is ongoing maintenance, not a finish line. A tech startup offered to build them a scheduling tool for free after a developer came to a workshop and realized his code could be better used here than on his third side project. Malik negotiated deliverables like he had negotiated vendor terms. Avery wrote the agreement in plain English with clauses you could explain to a grandmother. One afternoon, Avery sat with a 19-year-old who had a jewelry business on Instagram and a notebook full of designs. They talked trademarks and taxes and what happens when your cousin wants to invest with vibes instead of a term sheet. The girl looked up at one point and said, "I didn't know the law could sound like this." Avery said, "Neither did I once." They smiled the complicated smile of two people from different maps who recognized the same landmark. They lost cases sometimes. They were outmaneuvered by money or smothered by a process designed for slowness. They learned to mourn without letting the mourning set up permanent camp. They taught their people how to appeal. They taught their people how to breathe through no and try again. Not because hustle porn is a virtue, but because communities deserve tools, not just pep talks. Avery kept teaching incorporation on Saturdays, and one morning she added a slide that said, "Your business is not just a hustle, it is an inheritance you are writing in real time." Heads lifted, pens moved. The room seemed to stand a bit taller. The evening they closed their first year, they turned off the lights and stood in the doorway and looked at the small space that had grown huge without expanding a single wall. Malik asked one more time the question he loved. "Are you happy?" She laughed because the answer had become a ritual. "Yes." And also tired, and also hungry for year two. He kissed her and said, "Good." Then he said something he had been thinking for a month. "Let's expand. Hire one attorney who grew up within 20 blocks of here, and a second consultant who can run numbers faster than me. Open late 2 nights a week for people who can't come on Saturdays." She looked at the calendar, the budget, the wall they had erased and redrawn 10 times. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said, "let's do the bigger version without losing the small." They wrote a job posting that sounded like a person, not a machine. They interviewed 3 attorneys and chose the one who carried a notebook with corners softened by overuse, and said her favorite clients were the ones who arrived nervous and left holding a plan. They hired a consultant who solved the sample case in half the time, and then taught them a better way to build the cash map they had invented. They laughed and pretended not to be threatened by being taught. Growth humbled them. That was the point. Avery visited the law school she had once walked through like a woman on rails and spoke to a room of students about how to measure a life. She said kindness is a skill, not an accident. She said the law needs translators. She said pick a city and love it on purpose. A student asked if leaving a big firm was career suicide. Avery said it was career resurrection. The room hummed with a sound she recognized now as possibility taking notes. On a quiet Tuesday, Catherine came by the storefront. Avery saw her mother stop on the sidewalk, read the sign, watch the bus stop kid wave, see the way Malik's laugh lived in the paint. Catherine stepped inside like a person entering a church that isn't hers and sat in the visitor chair at the front, the one they kept for people who needed a minute before they decided to be brave. I came to see, Catherine said. Avery poured her decent coffee and didn't apologize for the paper cups. Malik set a plate of bakery cookies on the table, smiled, and disappeared into the back with a stack of forms, giving them a room that still felt like theirs. Catherine asked questions about budgets and clients and whether this kind of work could scale without losing its soul. Avery answered with numbers and stories, not to sell her mother, but to invite her to look. Slowly, something in Catherine's expression loosened. She touched a finger painting on the wall, the one with a lopsided heart, and the words, "Thank you, Miss Avery," in purple marker. She exhaled, a long sound a person makes when letting go of a story that has kept them safe and small. "I misjudged," she said. "I wanted safety for you. I forgot to ask you what your version of safe feels like." Avery took her mother's hand. "Safe feels like this room," she said. "Like work that lets me sleep. Like loving someone who stands with me when rooms get small." Catherine nodded once, then again. "Tell me how to help without taking over," she said. Avery laughed and gave her 3 options that would make a difference and leave the center of gravity right where it belonged. Later, Avery and Malik walked home through air that smelled like the first true spring, the kind that arrives on a Tuesday without an announcement. He said, "Your mother came back." She said she did. He said, "How does your heart feel?" She said, "Like a city map with another bridge drawn in." At the corner, the bus stop teen waved again. He grinned and shouted across the street that he had pitched his teacher about an after-school entrepreneurship club, and she said yes. He said he was going to bring them to the Saturday workshop. Malik high-fived the air between them and promised donuts. They reached their door. Malik paused with his hand on the knob and turned back. "Remember the first night," he said. "The rain and your watch and my cart and the way you looked through the glass like a person who had started to suspect there was another room behind the room." "I remember," she said. "Do you think we could start right here?" she had asked back then, not out loud but with her eyes and the way she refused to pretend he was invisible. "We did start right there," he said now, "and here we are." She took his face in both hands and kissed him once, a kiss that contained gratitude and grit and a year's worth of learning. The city around them kept breathing. The practice kept humming. The sign on their door kept telling the truth. "You belong here." Inside, the phone blinked with a new voicemail. A woman's voice said she had heard from her cousin that there was a place on Rainier Avenue that didn't laugh when you didn't know the right word. She said she had a dream and a notebook and a kid and a landlord who didn't return calls. She asked if someone could help her learn the map. Avery pressed save. Malik pulled out the calendar. The future, which had once felt like a script someone else had written in a language she could mimic but not believe, now looked like a list they would build together in pencil and ink. They turned on the lights.